Today we have a presenter on the Gray's Meadow Restoration Project. David Leptich is a wildlife biologist for Idaho Fish and Game. Dave is a wildlife biologist and he represents the state of Idaho in the Restoration Partnership. He's lived and worked in the Coeur d'Alene Basin for more than 30 years. His professional experience includes research and management of game, waterfowl, and other wildlife. Although most of his career has been spent with the Idaho Department of Fish and Game, he's also worked internationally and taught at a university level. He enjoys hunting and fishing and a broad assortment of other outdoor and recreational pursuits. So welcome, Dave. Thanks so much for joining us. As usual, we are going to save questions for the end, but you can always type your questions at any time into that Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. You can also do them through the chat. So feel free to do those anytime. We'll just save them all for the end. And then, yeah, I'll hand it over to you, Dave, to share your screen. Thanks everybody for joining us.
Okay, well, thank you first to the U of I and also to the GEM Collaborative for inviting me to be here today. I'd like to welcome all the participants and thank you for taking time out of your busy day to join us and learn a little bit about the work that's being done to restore Gray's Meadow. Gray's Meadow is a collaborative wetlands-focused remediation and restoration project. And remediation and restoration may be a little bit of jargon for some of you. So just to clarify, remediation refers to actions that clean up, isolate, or otherwise reduce exposure to hazardous substances in the environment so that it's safe for human use and ecological receptors. In contrast, restoration refers to actions that improve the ecological integrity of the environment, usually towards some former or unimpaired condition. My partners at EPA and Coeur d'Alene Trust are leads on the remediation aspects of this project, and Idaho Fish and Game and my partners at the Restoration Partnership take leads in the restoration aspects. Now, restoration implies that something's not right and there's a need or desire to make it right. So what I want to do is start with looking back and telling you the story of how we got to the place where we need to do restoration at Gray's Meadow, and then look forward to the Gray's Meadow project vision and how we hope to affect and realize our restoration project at the site. Now, every good story needs a setting to provide some context, and there's usually three fundamental attributes. A geographical context that tells you where the story occurred or is occurring, a temporal context that tells you when or across what time period the story occurs, and finally a social or cultural context so that we can relate to the characters. Our story occurs in the Coeur d'Alene Basin of North Idaho, and if you can see my cursor here, that stretches from the Idaho-Montana divide all the way to the Washington line where the Spokane River leads the state. The Coeur d'Alene Basin includes both the North Fork and South Fork of the Coeur d'Alene River. They come together, confluence to create the main stem just above Cataldo, and then flow down to Lake Coeur d'Alene near Harrison. Above the confluence of the North Fork and South Fork is typically referred to as the Upper Basin, and below the confluence is typically referred to as the Lower Basin. The Upper Basin typically has higher gradient rivers and streams, narrower drainages, and colder, faster moving water, whereas the Lower Basin has lower gradients, slower, warmer water, and a broad floodplain that includes these lateral lakes and many wetland acres. Our story will actually begin in the Upper Basin in the South Fork here, and both literally and figuratively over time move downstream to the Lower Basin to a different temporal and cultural context. Our story begins with the rich mining history of the Coeur d'Alene Basin. In 1882, Andrew Pritchard discovered gold in the North Fork of the Coeur d'Alene River, and by 2 years later, there was a substantial gold rush to the Upper Basin. The following year, in 1885, Noah Kellogg locates the Bunker Hill mine on the South Fork and discovered silver, which ended up being the true riches of the Coeur d'Alenes, and the sort of Silver Valley world-class mining district was born. He was extensively developed over the next 100 years. The district has over 300 historic mining and mill sites, and it includes the deepest, richest, and largest silver mines in the United States. It's produced over 7 billion with a B in metal, including more than 5 million ounces of silver, 21,000 tons of lead, 7,000 tons of zinc, and lesser amounts of gold and copper. Well, mining produces waste products, and from the 1880s through about 1968, mine waste were regularly discharged directly into the creeks and rivers of the Coeur d'Alene Basin. It's been estimated that there may be over 100 million tons of contaminated sediment that include lead, arsenic, zinc, and cadmium in the basin. This includes over 2.4 billion pounds of lead. Because waste were discharged to the creeks and rivers, water is the principal mechanism of dispersal of Coeur d'Alene mine waste in the basin. There are over 100 miles of contaminated streams and rivers, and it's been estimated that there's about 18,000 acres of contaminated wetlands in the lower basin, or more than 90%. Dispersal of toxic metals created human health and ecological disaster. Historically, we've had some of the highest blood lead levels in children recorded anywhere in the world, including China and India. Fish and aquatic life were reduced or even completely eliminated over large stretches of the South Fork of the Coeur d'Alene system. Panhandle Health District continues to have fish consumption advisories in the basin to reduce human exposure. Each year, we observe hundreds of dead swans and other waterfowl in the basin. Phytotoxicity, which is just a fancy term for poisonous to plant growth and survival, has reduced habitat cover and complexity. And there are over 40 square miles of Coeur d'Alene lake bed sediments with ecologically harmful lead concentrations. At this point, I just want to pause and be clear. The Grays Meadow partners are not anti-mining. We realize mining makes important contributions to the economy and to our society. We're talking about a different social and cultural context. Technologies and environmental safeguards have continued to improve. Our modern society enjoys and depends on products of our mining industry, even as we live with the legacy of some of the historic practices. I said our story would move from the upper to the lower basin. This is a map of the lower basin and fish and game ownership. The lower basin contains about 20,000 acres of wetlands. This is just to give you some geographic reference. This is the I-90 corridor here. Harrison's down here in the mouth of the Coeur d'Alene River where it flows into Coeur d'Alene Lake. One thing that we notice is a good juxtaposition throughout the basin of lacustrine or lake habitat, wetland habitat, which is mostly these ownerships that Fish and Game has, the riverine habitat, the river corridor that floods through that, and adjacent upland habitats. Good juxtaposition of these things is associated with high species diversity and ecosystem stability or resistance and resilience to disturbance. In fact, what we find is, in spite of its many ecological impairments, the casual visitor to the lower basin is impressed with the abundance and diversity of wildlife in the basin. Again, these orange boundaries represent Fish and Game ownership in the lower basin. We own approximately 50% of the wetlands in the lower basin. That public ownership creates a good physical and ecological continuity of wetland habitats through the entire length of the basin. This yellow boundary here is the Grays Meadow project that we're going to be talking about today. It was recently purchased, and you can see it helped sort of finalize or tie together the linkage that we have to the lower basin. Historic mining practices and contaminated soils are not the only impediments to Grays Meadow and the need for restoration. Modern transportation infrastructure developments in the form of access roads and a railroad causeway have created a hydrological separation between the Coeur d'Alene River and the Grays Meadow floodplain wetlands. The results include impaired wetland functions like floodwater storage and release, altered nutrient exchange, and altered wetland hydrology important to maintaining wetland diversity and productivity. You can follow my cursor here. This is the old railroad causeway between the river and our wetland basins. Currently, the Trail of the Coeur d'Alenes is built on top of that, and many of you may have actually traveled through this area. Here's some access roads along Black Lake that allowed former owners to get into these basins. Together, the Trail of the Coeur d'Alenes, old railroad causeway, and these access roads create two closed basins. This is what we refer to as the Lamb Peak or the West Wetland Basin, and this is the East or Cave Lake Wetland Basin. Annually, these two closed basins receive more water through precipitation and surface water than they lose through groundwater seepage and evapotranspiration. And because they're closed, they gain water depth over time and would become shallow lakes rather than wetlands were it not for annual pumping that occurred in the past, which brings me to my final or last important impairment. Grays Meadow has a long history of agricultural land use dating back to the 1920s and 30s. These photos are from the Grays Meadow restoration site immediately before and after Fish and Game took ownership. Like many wetlands in North America, Grays Meadow was extensively ditched and drained in the early 20th century, converted to agricultural production. You can see part of the ditch system here. That water runs to a pump system and is transferred to Black Lake. As previously mentioned, the artificial isolation requires the water be transferred. One problem from the past was that agricultural inputs from fertilizer and livestock manure created discharge waters with high nutrient loads and caused a negative impact on Black Lake water quality. Okay, we're going to shift our focus from the past to looking forward. This is the actual Grays Meadow site. It was a 1,000-acre ranch that Fish and Game purchased in 2017 for the express purpose of wetlands restoration. It includes 700 acres of historic wetland habitat in those two closed basins, Cave Lake Basin here and Lamb's Peak Basin here, separated by the north end of Black Lake. The east side or Cave Lake Basin is about 150 acres. The west side is much larger, 550 acres. Property includes over 5 miles of riverine frontage on Coeur d'Alene River. Includes about 3/4 mile of lake frontage here and is bisected by about 5 miles of the Trail of the Coeur d'Alene that runs to the north end of the project area. The project goals are pretty basic and straightforward, but they're not that easy to achieve. We want to clean up the dirty dirt or contaminated soils to a point where there's less than or equal to or less than 530 milligrams of lead per kilogram to protect human and ecological health. That action threshold is based on chronic toxicity levels to waterfowl that have been established in the past. We want to convert the agricultural land back to healthy, diverse, functioning wetland habitat. We want to be able to manage or mitigate recontamination risk to protect the project investments. We're going to be spending millions of dollars to do this restoration, and we want to minimize the risk to have it recontaminated with new sediments. We want to improve water quality in general and Black Lake in particular. And finally, provide safe recreational, educational, and cultural opportunities for the public. Before jumping into the work we've been doing in our remediation and restoration strategies, I want to talk about a little bit different approach that we're taking and elaborate a little on the sort of the superiority of integration as a collaborative work model. Typically, remediation and restoration are executed as complementary actions, kind of like two puzzle pieces that fit together in sequence, but they're distinct with their own hard edges. With that approach, remediation and restoration typically have their own goals and approaches. There may be some high-level coordination of those independent actions, but honestly, opportunities for review and input are frequently limited to the 30%, 60%, and 90% review points. And in some sense, they're untimely because a lot of the significant decision-making has already occurred. Because it's already occurred, it's often costly to incorporate feedback, and cost savings or additional project benefits that might have been realized are missed. With our integration model, remediation and restoration and the supporting disciplines are combined into a single entity, much like the ingredients in a cake that lose their individual identity to the new whole. On our team, we don't have separate remediation and restoration teams. Rather, EPA and the Fish and Game Department have assembled a single unified design team with expertise from across multiple disciplines that contribute to the remediation and restoration work. The team has a single vision that encompasses the entire remediation and restoration process. The result is improved efficiency and outcomes because, first, we have close and ongoing communication during the entire planning and design process. We're holding monthly meetings so everyone is in the room involved at every step. There's a decrease in miscommunication because you can ask questions and get and give feedback in real time. This leads to a more common understanding of the needs and wants across disciplines. It helps with early problem identification, and importantly, it fosters and supports collaborative problem solving, and everyone on the team is invested in and has ownership in the solutions and outcomes to that problem solving. Consequently, there's a decrease in wasted effort, an increase in opportunity identification, and all the disciplines have an increased influence on the ultimate outcomes. When it gets time to actually implement the project, we expect higher efficiency because there's a decrease in the need for contracting and overhead, because instead of implementing two separate remediation and restoration projects, you simply execute one combined project. There's a decrease in mobilization costs because the same contractor addresses all of the issues with the same equipment, and there's improved coordination and communication during construction because there's a single construction management voice. Okay, the team has spent a considerable amount of time the last 2 years investigating the project site and collecting data to support our design process and remediation and restoration strategy. We installed 17 piezometers in the winter of 2018-2019 to better understand groundwater movements in relationship to surface water changes that occur in the Coeur d'Alene River and Black Lake with high spring flows and seasonal operation of the Post Falls Dam. What we found is the soils are very tight and there's very poor groundwater connectivity between the wetland basins and the Coeur d'Alene River or Black Lake surface water changes. And geotechnical studies have confirmed that these tight soils extend to a depth between 5 and 15 feet. As a result, the wetland water budget is driven by annual precipitation and seasonal surface flows with negligible groundwater recharge or seepage losses. Another thing we looked at was we conducted extensive soil sampling to better map the concentration and both the horizontal and vertical distribution of toxic metals at the project site. We conducted both XRF and lab analysis of lead, zinc, cadmium, arsenic, and copper from the ground surface to depths as great as 60 inches in some locations. Additionally, we did some agronomic soil sampling. One of the lessons that we've learned from earlier lower basin projects is that there can be a significant decrease in soil productivity that results from remedial actions that remove or otherwise reposition upper soil horizons, and that can have a negative effect on restoration revegetation efforts. These studies should help us plan for soil amendments should they be needed and be able to apply them prior to restoration revegetation efforts and help us to more quickly reestablish wetland plant communities. As you will see in a few minutes, one of our remediation strategies includes consolidation sites that may be inundated. Because of this, we are also conducting lead and zinc leaching studies to ensure that metals won't solubilize in our consolidation sites and be released to migrate through ground and surface water. Just to give you some idea of the size of the problem out there, we've estimated that there's approximately 300,000 cubic yards of soil that need to be remediated at Gray's Meadow. To help you picture that, that would be 25,000 12-yard dump trucks full of soil. To help you picture that, if you parked 25,000 12-yard dump trucks bumper to bumper, they would extend almost 120 miles. There is a lot of soil that needs remediation at this site. Many of you may know, and I mentioned earlier, that there's significant water quality issues at Black Lake in the past. When Gray's Meadow was in private ownership and in ag production, runoff carrying both livestock manure and hayfield fertilizers were pumped directly into Black Lake annually. A 2011 TMDL identified water transfers from the Gray's Meadow fields to Black Lake as one of the significant sources of nutrient loading. These nutrients have contributed to recurrent summertime blue-green algae blooms that create health concerns, impact recreational use of Black Lake, and make for some unhappy neighbors. Since Fish and Game took ownership, the livestock have been removed and fertilization of hayfields has ceased, resulting in some improvements, but nutrient loading still remains higher than desirable. Because wetlands act as a natural filter and wetlands plants uptake nutrients, the agricultural to wetland conversion that we are going to undertake is expected to further improve water quality. Our project managers are taking water quality issue very seriously, and they're actually driving some of our design considerations and the implementation schedule. This includes a design that completely avoids future water transfers directly to Black Lake and limiting water transfers to the Coeur d'Alene River to the cooler winter months when biological activity is lower, or to high spring flow periods where there's improved mixing, dilution, and flushing through the downstream waters. Currently, in coordination with the Idaho Department of Environmental Quality and the Coeur d'Alene Tribe water quality staff, we've been conducting year-long water quality monitoring project that will provide by far the best baseline Black Lake Gray's Meadow water quality data set available to date. We will use those data to evaluate the project's effectiveness in the future at improving water quality at the site and to make adaptive management changes if they're needed. Finally, in addition to studies of the physical characteristics of the project site to support our engineering and restoration designs, we've conducted cultural resource surveys to identify potential cultural resource sites and to avoid or mitigate the potential damage of remediation and restoration actions on cultural resources. There were no known cultural resource sites within the project boundary when the site was first selected. We did additional cultural resource surveys in 28, and they produced no new significant findings. Currently, the EPA, the Idaho State Historic Preservation Office, and the Coeur d'Alene Tribal Historic Preservation Office are close to completing a programmatic historic properties management plan that will protect cultural resources moving forward as this project goes to execution. That takes us to the 30% design. The design team released our 30% design documents for agency and public stakeholder review in September of 2020. Like most 30% designs, it's largely conceptual with limited hard engineering. Since that time, we've met with the major stakeholders, both agency and public, to receive their feedback. And currently we're working on the 60% preliminary design documents, incorporating the feedback that we received. Our basic remediation strategy involves three primary actions. First is excavation and removal of the most contaminated soils, mostly to a depth of about 12 inches, but some places as deep as 18 inches. We're going to consolidate those excavated soils on site into the core of project infrastructure like water management dikes and administrative access roads, and then cap them with a 12-inch layer of clean soil. The other strategy we're going to use is tilling. Some of the sites have lower metal concentrations, and tilling will be sufficient to mix and dilute metal contaminated soils with clean soils and reduce concentrations below our 530 remediation targets. This shows some of our characterization data at the Lamb Peaks field. The red dots that you see here are locations that we sampled where lead concentrations are above the 530 action threshold. White dots indicate that we're below the action threshold. There's no need for remediation on those sites. The highest concentrations tend to be here towards Black Lake at the east end of the Lambs Peak field, and they decrease as you move west. These blue shaded areas have high enough concentrations that this is where the excavation will occur. These yellow areas have lower concentrations. This is where the tilling will occur. And the unshaded areas are already below the action threshold, and no remediation will occur there, although some excavation may occur to provide clean capping materials for our sites. I didn't show the Cave Lake field, but Cave Lake field is not as contaminated as Lambs Peak, and tilling will be the only remediation strategy that we use there. Moving to remediation, one fundamental aspect of our restoration strategy is to capitalize on remediation. The remediation needs to consolidate all those soils and use them and those materials on site to construct the infrastructure and habitat features that we need to restore wetland habitat and manage the site going forward. This includes needing things like access roads for management activities and to provide the public with access to wetland-based recreation, the need to create water-controlled dikes to be able to manage water levels individually in smaller wetland cells, and provide a measure of recontamination risk reduction, and the need to build habitat features like nesting and loafing islands to benefit wildlife. Contamination consolidation areas become the core of these structures that we need to build to meet these needs. Consequently, we're able to meet multiple objectives, increase efficiency, and reduce costs by addressing both the remediation and the restoration need with a single action. Our wetlands restoration plan depends on three major habitat features. The first is microtopography. Microtopography refers to small changes in ground surface elevation and therefore water depth and the extent and juxtaposition of this variability across the wetland. Okay, why is this important? Different plant communities are adapted to different inundation and moist soil regimes. Variability leads to plant community diversity and dispersion by maintaining multiple habitats. And you can see that in this picture here. There's variable water depths across this wetland. You've got cattails here, you've got wapato here, different emergence here, and that's related to variation in water depth. Different wildlife exploit different plant communities differently. Think of like plovers on the mudflats, dabbling ducks like widgeon and mallards in shallow water areas, yellow warblers in the riparian fringe, and maybe diving ducks or grebes out in the deeper open water areas. Remediation and restoration integration involves looking at the existing grading, which is shown here, and the contamination lens, and developing a new grading plan to consolidate the contamination and cap them with clean biomaterials while leaving a variable surface topography that maximizes the habitat conditions. And this is actually for another project at Robinson Creek, but we did a similar thing here. We removed soils, we stored them in a large landscape-sized dike here, and regraded the site to have variable water depth. The second feature is edge complexity. Ecological edge occurs at the boundary or transition area between two or more communities or ecosystems. In ecology, we call this an ecotone. Ecological edges are characterized by higher population densities and more complex community structure, and that's what makes them desirable. Here we have an example of an open water and upland edge. It's much like microtopography. You can see that diversity is tied to changes in water depth, soil moisture characteristics, and microsite changes like the degree of shading that influences plant community and ultimately the wildlife that depends on it. Complexity has to do with increasing the habitat value on the same land base. If you look at these diagrams, all of these individual pictures have the same amount of green and yellow habitat, but they have a different amount of edge complexity. Even simple things like putting a few peninsulas and varying the edge of a road or a dike can double the amount of edge and that interspersion and complexity that influences plant communities and the wildlife that depend on them. So how are we going to incorporate that with our remediation and restoration integration? Well, road and dike margins are not going to end up as straight lines. We're going to add spits and peninsulas to increase both contamination storage area, but also to increase edge complexity, and finally increase the aesthetic appeal of the restored wetland. We'll also have loafing islands and nesting islands and deep water bow arrows to increase the edge length along those islands and increase, again, storage areas for remediation. Third and final primary restoration feature is water management. Hydrological variability in both the timing, depth, and duration of inundation is critical to maintaining complex wetland communities and productivity. Stable water levels degrade wetlands and reduce productivity over time. This is related to two major processes. The first is biomass and nutrient cycling. When soils are permanently inundated, an anaerobic condition develops, and under those conditions, nutrients bind to soil particles and are not available to plants, and there is also a reduction in the breakdown of organic material. By having the ability to periodically draw down and dry wetland soils, we expose them to oxygen, they dry, it releases the nutrients and makes those nutrients available to the plant for plant uptake and increasing growth when we reflood the site. The other process is plant succession and disturbance. Even though a lot of these emergent wetland plants are adapted to live and grow with their inundated conditions, they're unable to germinate directly in water and need exposed mudflats from time to time to germinate and revitalize the wetlands plant community. That's the one side, that stimulates new growth. The other problem that we have with stable water levels is you tend to get encroaching and often monotypic plant communities that dominate the site. You probably have all seen cattail marshes where there's very little open water. You see very few other plants other than cattails, and they're choking the whole site. By being able to raise the water level and drown out some of that vegetation, you reopen open water areas, you follow that with a drawdown, expose those mud flats, and it encourages new plants to come in and sets back succession on the site and increases, again, productivity. Finally, the final project goal was recreation, educational, and cultural access opportunities. The transfer from private to public ownership opens new educational, recreational, and cultural opportunities to the general public. Post-project implementation, this will be a clean public rec site within the lower basin. It's easily accessible to the public through the 5 miles of bordering Trail of the Coeur d'Alenes. It has 3,700 feet of Black Lake shoreline. It adjoins Highway 3 at the east end of the property. So there's easy access by bike, boat, motorized vehicle, and foot. Opportunities that we look to pursue is improved parking, INE signage, information signage, that can talk about the remediation and restoration history, give people information about general wetlands ecology, be opportunities for both consumptive and non-consumptive recreation like bird watching, photography, hunting and fishing, hiking, biking. And as part of the planting plan, we will include culturally significant plants like wapato and camas to part of the vegetation scheme to support traditional gathering traditions. Okay, I want to wrap up with just a couple more slides and take a quick look at some of the design features and context. We talked about needing access roads, both for construction and after the project for public access and habitat management. This is Black Lake here. We're going to widen and improve the entrance road and place a new parking area here. This public access road runs along the Trail of the Coeur d'Alenes right here. It's only separated by a T-post and wire fence right now. When we widen the road, we're going to install jersey barriers, which will create a massive barrier and increase safety to cyclists and pedestrians using the trail. Currently, there is an old farm bridge here. It's inadequate to support our construction traffic. That will be replaced and provide a new safe place for both management vehicles and the public to enter the wetland. These lines here represent combined management roads and water control dikes. They extend across the larger wetland basin at these points and create from the one large basin 3 management cells. That'll allow us to manage water independently in those cells, and also decreases recontamination risk. In the years when occasionally water will come over the trail, or should there ever be a mass failure in the causeway, it's likely that we'll be able to capture that contaminated material in a single cell and it won't contaminate the entire basin. Talked about habitat features, principally microtopography and edge complexity. This is the Cave Lake field. This is our deepest cell in the whole project. You can see here there's a couple of islands that we'll use to consolidate contamination and increase habitat edges. You can note out here in the field, these are shallow excavations that will increase water depth, complexity, and provide borrow arrows and clean material to cap our various storage areas. Initially, all the dikes are designed and the access roads are designed to a basic standard engineering design with 17-foot broad tops, 2-to-1 side slopes to ensure that they meet the structural standards. But after that, they're going to be augmented with additional material to eliminate that straight line feature. You can see here, conceptually, we'll add different points and peninsulas, small irregularities that will increase edge complexity. The addition of that additional material will also decrease side slopes from 2-to-1 to greater than or equal to 8-to-1, making the whole feature more massive, which further reduces the probability of structural failure of these things. Also, muskrats prefer to make bank dens in slopes that are less than 3-to-1. So by having these general slopes, it reduces the probability of animal burrowing damage and further reduces the risk of structural failure. Finally, roads and dikes that appear as more massive landscape features with variable slopes and complex edges reduces or eliminates the highly engineered look of narrow, symmetrical straight line features and have a more natural aesthetic appeal. We'll be installing some new parking areas. Again, this is the Cave Lake field. We're going to install a new parking area here adjacent to the road and dike system. It will allow people to cross this road dike to the Trail of the Coeur d'Alenes. Currently, you're not allowed to leave the Trail of the Coeur d'Alenes because the trail at Remedy ends at 2 feet off the trail. We'll put a clean apron here and provide a designated access point to leave the trail. This also solves a trail management concern because people have a tendency to want to get off the trail, get to these other public sites, and they pioneer trails across contaminated soil by providing designated clean on and off locations. Facilitates reducing those risks. We'll be providing an ADA access blind here, both for ADA hunting opportunity, but also photography and viewing opportunity. We're actively working to move our water transfer structure. Currently, we have a pump here that puts water into Black Lake. That discharge is being moved to the Coeur d'Alene River here. That'll help reduce nutrient loading of Black Lake. We should eliminate, or at least substantially eliminate, summertime blue-green algae blooms and recreational impairments to Black Lake. And then, of course, as I mentioned earlier, cold weather and high flow condition discharges should mitigate any new impacts to the river. Waters that were formerly discharged into Black Lake actually ended up in the Coeur d'Alene River as it flowed out of there. So these aren't really new loads, they're just relocated loads, and they're discharged at a better timing. To wrap up, the tentative schedule for moving this project forward is we released the 30% design last September. This March, which is only a month away, we're going to initiate access and water transfer infrastructure improvements by moving that pipe discharge on the Cave Lake field. We hope to have the 60% design complete by early summer and put that out for agency and public review, and complete the 100% design by the end of the calendar year, which will allow us to do contracting in the spring and early summer. And we expect the remediation and restoration work to begin in the fall of 2022. With that, I've come to the tail's end. And so if Marie would like to field any questions, I'd be glad to answer them if I can. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Dave. We do have some questions. We have a few related to the contaminated soils. So somebody says, I believe I heard you say excavation and capping of metal contaminated soils was one of the tools being used. Was in situ or ex situ technology considered or available to be evaluated as options?
Okay, so in situ, I mean, we're actually doing that with the tilling. We're actually treating it on site in place by mixing it in the location that we find it with deeper clean soils. So in that sense, we're doing in situ in the places that we're tilling. To pick up these soils and move them to an off-site repository is exceedingly expensive. When you talk about, transporting 25,000 12-yard dump trucks versus being able to use bulldozers and belly scrapers to pick up and drop that material right on the same site. We did, consider those options, but it just is far more economically feasible, and it integrates very well with our restoration strategies to do everything on site. Perhaps I hope I answered the question and didn't answer something other than the question, but that's how I understood it. I'd be glad to revisit it.
I think so. That's how I understood it as well. And if anybody has further questions, please put them in the Q&A. Let's see, we have a question. Is this remediation approach similar to what was done at the Schlepp property further upriver?
No, or at least it's different in significant ways. What they did at the Schlepp property is they basically did a soil flip. They dug a trench that was, I don't know what the design numbers were, but I'll say it was 4 feet deep. Then they moved next to it, took the dirty soil off the top 18 inches, put it in the bottom of that 4-foot trench that they had just dug. Then they deepened the second trench, got the deep, clean soils, put them on top. So now they capped the dirty soils in the first trench and had a new open trench, and they did that all the way across the field until all the soils that were on top ended up buried, and all the deep, clean soils on the bottom were used on site to cap. So in some sense, it's the same, because we're doing it on site and we're using we're burying the dirty soils, but we're putting them in consolidation areas. They won't be distributed across the entire wetland basin like they are at schleps. They'll be in our road prisms, in our dikes, and so forth. So similar outcome, I guess you would say, similar way of isolating it, but some distinct differences as well.
Okay, thank you. We have another question. You mentioned millions of dollars for restoration. Has the trustee council already pre-approved funding for this work?
So there's two main sources of funding for this. The Coeur d'Alene Trust is funding the remediation work, and the Restoration Partnership is funding the restoration portion of it. I wrote a $2.5 million grant 2 years ago. They approved that contingent on their review of our designs. And so part of the 60% and 90% design reviews, and even the 30% involve them taking a look at that. Since I'm part of the restoration partnership, since I'm within the technical team, there's ongoing communication. So, we would have to go down some rabbit trail to have that funding not approved, but it is contingent on their final review of the designs.
And that was a grant through the Restoration Partnership?
Yes. And the Coeur d'Alene Trust is a separate funding entity. That money has been approved for this use by EPA. Okay. And the trust operates at their direction.
Okay. We have another question. Wetlands provide habitats. Do they also provide any buffering or filtering of contaminants to areas downstream?
Well, if there was a functional floodplain and good connectivity where soils came in and were trapped, they would, because of the particular configuration in those isolated basins, they won't really function to reduce contamination other than the metals that are currently leaving because they're at the surface. So in that sense, yes, once we bury them and cap them, they'll cease to lose those basins, those two closed basins during discharge, but we still won't have that normal connectivity that we have when the floodplain is connected to the river. On the other hand, as I mentioned, this will provide substantial downstream benefits in terms of nutrient loading because the wetlands act as sediment filters and uptake nutrients into the plant materials. So I guess the answer is yes, but not in the typical way that you might think.
Okay.
Because of that disconnection for the floodplain.
Yeah, that makes sense. This is kind of a technical question. What is the maximum depth of piezometers and what lithology did you encounter at depth?
I'm not a geotech person. We drove those to a depth of, I think, 10 feet. The soils were very, very tight. The geotech information that we gathered said that there was that tight clay layer that extended. It was 5 to 15 feet thick. And I think the geotech guys went down to a depth of 50 feet below ground surface or until they hit bedrock. There is another water layer underneath that clay layer. But again, there's no groundwater connectivity between the lake, the river, and these basins because of that thick type layer. If somebody has a important technical interest in that, they should contact me directly and I can put them in touch with Lal Foster, who did that work for us and is the repository of that data currently.
Great, thank you. What have been some of the biggest challenges of your work? And have there been any unexpected hurdles?
You know, I think this project has gone extremely well to date. You know, when you have multiple government agencies, lots of outside agency and public stakeholders, the wheels grind fairly slowly. Everybody on the design team has been very happy with the integrated approach, and everybody being in the same room for discussions. We just recently added IDEQ and Coeur d'Alene Tribe water quality staff to the core design team. Even though they've been reviewing our work, they're actually going to be in those meetings now, and I think they're excited about that. Probably the biggest blip in the road has been frustration by the Black Lake property owners with ongoing pumping into the lake and the water quality impacts that has on their recreational use of the lake. We actually had a big, fairly unfriendly meeting out at the lake last summer, ended up in the paper. We've actually developed a pretty good working relationship with those folks since then. They've been promised for over 30 years that something was going to be done. And I think that's one reason that we've accelerated some of the infrastructure developments and moving the discharge points is to address that issue earlier. So I can't think of any particular technical difficulty or administrative difficulty that we've encountered to this point. And, in spite of the initial rub with the landowners, they thought as soon as Fish and Game got it, this would stop. A good portion of them understand that this is a necessary evil to get to the final solution, and some have just frankly run out of patience. And I can't blame them. If you own lakeshore property and your grandkids come and can't go swimming, that's huge. So I'm very sympathetic to their concerns.
So kind of a follow-up question to that. What does the long-term pumping operations and maintenance look like? The costs and timing of that?
Okay. So there still may be some need to pump for the next 3 years as we do construction, because we'll have to have dry basins when we're out there. But by the end of 2021, those pump discharges will be redirected from Black Lake into either the Coeur d'Alene River, or we're also going to add gravity drains into the river and the tide channel. So by the end of May of this year, we should never pump into Black Lake, but we may need to pump into the river during construction. After that, pumping is actually very expensive and not something Fish and Game wants to do. When we need to do water transfers to lower water levels in the basins, we will do that during the winter low time when the Coeur d'Alene River is down. We can gravity transfer water. That's free. It occurs at a time when water is cold and biological activity is minimal. So any nutrients that do go into that system will have a minimal impact and be followed by the spring runoff flush, which increases the mixing, as I mentioned earlier, dilution, and helps push those nutrients through the system. So really the only time after construction is complete that I expect to pump is if there was some kind of emergency maintenance need. If there was a failure and there was a need to pump at a time when we were unable to gravity pump. But I expect 3 years from now, maybe other than running them for an hour just to maintain them, we won't be using the pumps that much.
Okay. And as kind of a follow-up that goes along with that, you said that there'd be discharge during construction into the river. Do you foresee that having hazardous effects on the biota in the water and the water itself?
I don't, because this is the same water that's entered the system for all these years. It's just gone through Black Lake first. Really, we can anticipate, our need to have those fields dry, so we can drop and lose that water in the window in the winter. We can pump early in the spring during those high flows, and there should really be. We'll get most of the water off before the warm summer season occurs. So I think it will have negligible effect. We are actually working with IDEQ and the Coeur d'Alene Tribe water quality staff to do some additional water quality studies going forward to look at potential impacts. And they're going to be part of a water management planning team and put together a water management plan so that we manage those discharges to have maximum benefits and minimal liabilities. So we have both agency water quality staff helping us with discharge planning.
Great. Good to hear. Who will be doing any operations and maintenance on the project once it's complete?
Fish and Game will have responsibility for that. EPA and the Coeur d'Alene Trust will remain involved during the first 5 years post-construction, just in case, there's any unforeseen engineering issues or failures, before soils are completely settled, before plants capture site is a time when new structures are most at risk for failure. So they'll be involved for the first 5 years, but long-term management will be a Fish and Game responsibility.
Okay, great. Well, I'm not seeing any other questions come through. We're having a couple comments of just great work on the project, and people are pretty excited that this project is going forward. So yeah, unless there's any last minute questions that come through, we will.
Well, I just want to invite folks to contact me directly if they have follow-ups or questions or something that's technical that you don't think will be of interest in the broader group. Also, thank you for your patience. It is, if any of you have given these things virtually, it's very difficult to speak to a computer screen and not have the feedback from the audience and stuff. So thank you for bearing with me.
It is. I promise that there are people on the on here. I do actually see one more question comes through. Let me see. Given that Black Lake has a storehouse of toxic metals and nutrients, do you see Black Lake continuing to self-fertilize from internal cycling to create serious nutrient problems into the future? And do you think that help will ever be healthy for swimming?
So I guess I do want to set some future expectations, and my partners at the Coeur d'Alene Tribe and DEQ have warned me to do this. Even though that TMDL identified Gray's Meadow as a significant nutrient loading source, it is not the only source, and it is not the only significant source. And so changing discharge of these fields from the lake to the river isn't a panacea to solve all future water quality problems in Black Lake. That said, it should make a significant difference. And I will leave it to my DEQ and Coeur d'Alene tribal staff to address that question at some future meeting, because it's really outside my wheelhouse. But change the discharge isn't going to be the final answer. It should substantially improve water quality and reduce blue-green algae blooms and associated recreational impairment.
Okay. One more quick question. If it's called Black Lake Ranch, where does the name Gray's Meadow come from?
It's actually a historic name from a future owner. And the problem we were having both internally and with the public is about 3 years ago, we started a project. We just recently, completed at Black Rock Slough. So you have all these people working or living in the basin. We're talking about Black Rock Slough and Black Lake Ranch. It was constantly getting confused. And so we just found it easier to go to a historic name. Also on the Trail of Coeur d'Alene maps, they identify it on their trail map as Gray's Meadow. So it aligned with our sister agency naming of the facility. So that's how we moved from Black Lake Ranch to Gray's Meadow.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right. Well, with that, I would like to say just thank you very much to everybody who tuned in for this presentation, and also our previous presentations earlier this week and last week. And time, we'd always love to hear for other ideas of topics you're interested in, because we do hope to host another series like this later in the spring. And I would like to say a big thank you to Dave for joining us and giving this presentation. It was really interesting, and really looking forward to see the progress on that meadow. So thank you, Dave, and thank you everybody else.